So hello there and welcome to a brand new episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast, the show where we talk all of the latest news, gossip and events in the world of Formula 1 and we relay that back to you for your listening or viewing pleasure, depending of course on which platform you choose to follow us on. And guys, just a fair warning, of course, bear with me on this one because as well as the crazy race that we experienced for a plethora of reasons, I managed to just about catch it because I was a little bit behind on the broadcast, but because of the red flags that I was able to catch up because I've just got back from a weekend in Newcastle, so I'm a little bit tired and a little bit wavy at the moment, but other than that, all good and ready to get into a race review. And what a Grand Prix it was for a myriad of reasons, so much going on, so much controversy, so many incidents, but one constant that did remain was Lewis Hamilton winning the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, the inaugural Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, as Lewis Hamilton, I should say, so often wins at brand new circuits, and today was no different. However, it was oh so strange and oh so controversial. Another incident, or another few incidents actually, to talk about between him and Max Verstappen, his championship rival. Of course, the championship now hangs in the balance going into the final Grand Prix of the season in Abu Dhabi, which of course we will be previewing later on in the week. But the one headline to take from all of this is that both Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton are now tied on points. We actually have the situation, the scenario, the championship finale battle that we all wanted, a one-race shootout between the two championship protagonists. But of course, we will worry about that in a few days' time when we preview the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. We're going to focus on the review for the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. And joining me on this episode, a familiar face and friend of the podcast, it's my brother from the 1892 Reds podcast. It's Luke Burns. Luke, first of all, how are you doing this evening? And thanks for coming on the show once again.
That's all right. Thanks for letting me come on, Adam. I mean, what a race. I mean, as we said before, this season just never fails to amaze people. It's, another race with a lot of controversy, a lot of action. And yeah, obviously we're going to get stuck into it. Obviously we're going into the final race potentially with both drivers level points, considering obviously with the appeal or the stewards inquiry, I should say. But another good spectacle. And we look forward to next week to the finale.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of things to look at regarding the stewards. Based on what we saw at this Grand Prix, of course, there's a few incidents that we'll talk about regarding Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen, which of course the stewards may decide to take a view on and may decide to add some retrospective, or take a retrospective look and add some further punishment where they feel is necessary. Hopefully that's not the case for either party. I think we're kind of in a nice situation right now with both drivers where they're both level on points. Of course, we should mention that if neither driver scores any points, or I think that's the only scenario actually where both drivers can be matched in terms of the points result, where neither of them score points, Max Verstappen will be the world champion based on countback, owing to the fact that he has won more races than Lewis Hamilton. There's no scenario now where they can actually be level on race wins or stuff like that.
There is. I think there's one. There
would have. I think. Well, for humour purposes, why don't you let me know what it is you think could happen?
So it's very unlikely it will happen, but as you said, like both drivers fail to score points. But if Max finishes 9th and Lewis finishes 10th with the fastest lap point, that's one scenario. Or the other way around, Max could finish 10th with the fastest lap point and Lewis 9th. I mean, it's very unlikely, but that's probably the only other solution compared to not scoring points. But yeah.
I stand corrected then, clearly. Anyway, let's move on. I've already had, as I said, it's been a long weekend and a long day, so I'm obviously not feeling 100%. Still, we'll just have to take it for what it is, and we'll just move on with that one. But no, absolutely right, actually. So yes, those are the scenarios where they could finish level on points at the end of the season and score points at the next race. But either way, Max Verstappen will be world champion if both he and Lewis Hamilton finish on the same number of points after the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix next week. So for those of you out there trying to figure out the permutations, it's basically simple. Whoever gets the best result becomes world champion. And that's the only right way to look at it in the end. Anyway, look, let's get into the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. And there's just so much to unpack from this. Of course, Lewis Hamilton winning the Grand Prix ahead of Max Verstappen. The two title rivals almost inevitably coming together on quite a few occasions this weekend. In qualifying, of course, we saw Lewis and Valtteri getting ahead of Max Verstappen on the final run. We saw that incredible lap from Max Verstappen. It looked for all the world it was going to be one of the greatest qualifying laps that we'd ever seen from any driver out there. Unfortunately for Max, he ended up putting it into the wall at the final corner, which cost him, So, there's a lot to pick from that one. But, of course, we'll get into the race itself. And at the very start of the race, of course, we had the two Mercedes guys on the front row ahead of Max Verstappen. And unlike what we saw in Mexico, the two Mercedes drivers pulled away very nicely. It wasn't the longest run down to turn one, which obviously helped them, but they were very much in formation. There was no confusion between the two, and they managed to keep Max Verstappen behind. And that's how it panned out for a while until a safety car was caused. I think it was around, lap 15 or something like that, where Mick Schumacher, it might have been a little bit earlier than that, but Mick Schumacher in the Haas, putting it into the wall at the exit of turn 21, losing the rear end of the car, as Charles Leclerc did actually earlier at the weekend in free practice. And then, of course, that caused the safety car, which forced the two Mercedes drivers into pit. And Red Bull Max Verstappen decided not to respond. And Red Bull were fortunate in making the right decision, because it ended up resulting in a red flag, which put Max Verstappen ahead of both the Mercedes drivers and allowed them to have a free pit stop as well. One thing I think we should unpick from this, because this kind of sets the tone for what we're going to be discussing this weekend in terms of the tactics between both sets of drivers and the teams themselves. More of the dirty tactics, I think, that's been referred to a lot. There was one incident where Valterri Bottas was holding Max Verstappen up quite a lot during the safety car, because he wanted to not only give himself and the team plenty of time to do the double stack with both cars, but clearly he was trying to protect his teammate. It didn't work. What did you make of that, Luke? Were you happy? Do you think that was all fair game, or do you think that Valtteri Bottas should have been penalised for that incident of holding Max Verstappen up unnecessarily?
This is going to sound quite bizarre and quite strange, but I think Valtteri Bottas made himself look like a bit of a hypocrite there, because he said, I believe it was Lewis's 100th win in Portimao, and I believe it was Bottas. He come out and said about the leaders shouldn't be holding up people like that. It's going to cause an accident, under the safety car and then all that. And he's pretty much done the same thing today. He's actually held up Verstappen purely and simply for his teammate, because he wanted Lewis to be in front of Max. It didn't work. And I feel that Valtteri should have actually been penalised, to be honest, because he put other drivers at risk of a potential crash later on in the race. And I felt the tactic, as you said, dirty tactics, is definitely, you can see it from both teams, not just that instant from Mercedes, but Red Bull have obviously done it as well. And I think you're going to expect it at this point in the season. I mean, it's just, they're trying everything that they can do to actually stop the other team scoring as many points as possible. And obviously, in the end of it didn't work for Bottas, but I think he should have been penalised for it, because he clearly shouldn't be allowed to do it. And yeah, I mean, as I said to you, I generally think that Bottas maybe should have been given some sort of time penalty or something, maybe for that situation, but it didn't happen, and obviously they had to move on from it.
Well, this has been kind of the thing, because one of the themes that we've seen often this season that's come up is the stewards not necessarily being inconsistent. I mean, because that has been a problem. It's mostly because the stewards themselves, they seem to take a varying view of when to get involved and when not to get involved and who to get involved with. I mean, they've made quite a huge point over trying to not get involved in the championship battle between Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton. And more often than not, when they take that stance, it tends to bite them in the arse, for lack of a better way of putting it. And they end up forcing themselves into a position where they have to get involved. They end up getting involved by not doing anything. So it's a very strange one. I'll be honest with you, I thought it was a bit naughty, but we've seen a lot of times this season where stuff like this has happened, where Red Bull have done stuff to Mercedes, or vice versa, Mercedes in this case doing stuff to Red Bull, and it's just been part of those tactics. I'm not a fan of that kind of tactic, but I've seen it done a lot, and I've seen people take a dim view to it, and I've seen other days where they've penalised it. So It didn't work out for Mercedes on 2 counts because one, of course, Max Verstappen stayed ahead of the 2 Mercedes drivers and the red flag came. I don't really feel with the red flag situation that a lot of people were moaning about the fact that Max got a free pit stop and people were able to change the damage on the car. I think Lando Norris brought this up after the race as well, that he was annoyed about it. But I'm pretty sure he actually benefited from a situation like that in Imola earlier in the season. So sometimes it goes for you, sometimes it goes against you. It was unfortunate for Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton because at the time it seemed like they'd made the right call. But the red flag came out. Max got a free pit stop and was able to change his tyres and inherit the lead of the Grand Prix. But that brings us to the second start of the race, where, of course, Max Verstappen didn't get a very good start. And Lewis Hamilton managed to overtake him quite early on the run down to turn 1. But then Max went quite deep onto the exit of turn 1 to try and overtake Hamilton around the outside. Max was forced a little bit wide, but Max was never going to make that corner. It was always Lewis's corner, and then Max overtook Lewis off the road. But then, of course, where Max rejoined, and obstructed Lewis, it caused a concertina effect behind them, which led to an eventual incident between Sergio Perez and Charles Leclerc. Luke, bringing it back earlier to the incident between Max and Lewis, did you feel that Max had a case where he should have been given some space around the outside, or do you feel that it was a fair cop and that, it was Lewis's corner, Max should have just given the place up and not, keep him behind him?
I mean, it's no secret I'm a Max Verstappen fan, but in that situation, no, he was wrong. He illegally overtook Lewis Hamilton at that position. In that situation, you would say that he should hand the position back because, that was no way Max's corner after that start that he had. Lewis got away much better than him. And obviously, it caused the next effect of further down the line. Obviously, what happened with Perez and Leclerc, which I've just seen that no further action will be necessary for that incident, which I think Leclerc couldn't do nothing about it, could he? He just couldn't get out of the way. He had no space, and Perez didn't really have no space at all. So it was always an incident was going to happen. But I mean, going back to what I said, no, I think Max just overcooked the corner. I think he lost the position and just felt that there was enough room on the next corner. But no, he made the mistake, and it was a strange way to actually then, because obviously another red flag happened, didn't it? And it was, I know you're going to pick this up, but how the FIA have actually managed it, because I was thinking straight away, you get a 5-second time penalty if he doesn't give the position back. But it was really strange how it then further went down the line after.
It was an interesting one. I'll be honest with you, I actually very much enjoyed how Michael Massey handled that situation, because it was a red flag almost immediately. Of course, we saw the incident between Perez and Leclerc. I think it was very, very unfortunate for Sergio Perez because he had Pierre Gasly on one side of him, he had Leclerc on the other. He was trying to, wheedle his way between the two of them. And he did a very good job of it at first, but 3 cars going into such a narrow space, and the circuit's come under praise and criticism in equal measure. And we saw a lot of this in the F2 races over the weekend, that the track, there are dangerous elements to it, and perhaps it's not the best Tilke design that they could have possibly made, and it was all rushed a little bit, and of course the preparation was rushed and it wasn't really safe and everything else. Despite the excitement that it brought, of course it does come with that element of danger, I'd imagine, so that's another thing to talk about. But Charles Leclerc couldn't exactly disappear. He'd hit the wall as well in part of that incident. His left front tyre hit the wall a little bit, it's come back and it's caught Perez. Perez was just incredibly unlucky. And it was a race where you could argue that Red Bull really could have done with Perez being in that fight. But then after those red flags where Max had got ahead of the Mercedes and him and Lewis Hamilton completely left the field behind once the race eventually got underway for the third time, they were in a class of their own. So, Bottas and Perez were kind of moot points, even though Bottas did eventually get on the podium anyway. So it was just unfortunate for Perez. What it does do for the Constructors' Championship is put Mercedes in a commanding position now where they've pretty much almost got it won. It would take arguably a day where Red Bull 1 and 2 at Abu Dhabi and Mercedes to come away with practically next to nothing for them to win the Constructors' Championship. But of course, a result like that would give them both championships. So that's certainly something that they will shoot for. But it's unlikely that will probably come to fruition. So it does look like Mercedes are very much in the driving seat for the Constructors' Championship. Just looking on my phone, working this out in my head, I think it's about, it looks like, 28 points between, 28 points between the two of them. I believe Red Bull, sorry, I'm sorry to cut you off. I believe Red Bull have the most race wins. I think they have 10 and Mercedes have 9. So whilst in theory they could level that next weekend, by doing so would pretty much win the Constructors anyway, Mercedes. So it's not like they're going to be going for that. But I would have loved to have seen Pierre Gasly's on board in that incident, because he was on the right-hand side of Perez, and he probably wouldn't have given Perez too much room, but it was Leclerc's tyre that Perez connected with, and that pretty much sent him out of the race. Ruined his day. It's just really unfortunate. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, because those two were right up near the front before that safety car. They were fighting away for 4th and 5th. Charles Leclerc was doing a rather good job, impressive in qualifying despite the setback he had in practice. And Perez, he needed to get ahead of Leclerc as well, but he just couldn't do it. So just one of those weekends for Sergio Perez after 5 races where he was in a very rich vein of form, always finishing in the top 4. So that run's come to an end for him. So, what do you make of all that with Sergio Perez, Luke? Do you feel that, his second half of the season has been much improved from where he was earlier in the season? And do you hope for his sake he might be able to keep that going next season?
I think it's definitely a massive improvement from Perez. Obviously today wasn't his day. He was a bit unfortunate with the incident, but to be honest, I agree with you. I think he's had to be, Lewis this weekend called Bottas the best teammate of all time in F1. I mean, that just goes to show over the last, 4 to 5 years, Bottas has been always the standard bearer as the best teammate for a team. And obviously Lewis has always won the championship with Bottas helping him as well along the way. But I definitely think Perez has definitely helped Max in this position to be fighting for this championship to the last race. And I think he'll definitely be at his best in Abu Dhabi next weekend. Definitely it's been a massive improvement for Perez. And I think you've got to take into account he is, he's a race winner as well. He's won a race this season. He's got that experience now. It's not the fact of, they're looking at a driver that isn't sort of experienced enough to be at that top end of the field. He is good enough to be a race winner. So Perez definitely has improved, and I definitely think he's hopefully going to be on his A game for next weekend to try and help Max win the championship. And next year, as you said, that's got to be the confidence that he's got to be going into for the start of next season.
Yeah, I mean, if I was at Red Bull, I think with Perez is concerned, Perez has said already, quite outspoken about the fact that he's trying to help Max win this championship. Red Bull, in theory, yes, they could still win the Constructors' Championship, but I think Perez's priority should be to help Max. And if they have the opportunity to win the Constructors' Championship, then by all means go for it. But, they seem to be likely to win one championship. It's certainly going to be Max winning the drivers rather than Red Bull winning the Constructors at this point in time. It would take a lot from Mercedes' part as well as Red Bull for that to happen. But you're right about Bottas. Lewis made some really good comments about Bottas. I think it's a fair point. They've had a great relationship as teammates. Bottas has been a really good teammate to Lewis Hamilton. He's helped Lewis so often during his time at the team. And it's brought the best out of Valtteri. Sometimes it's not helped him so much in that situation to be considered the number 2 driver, or as Toto referred to as the perfect wingman. But, sometimes that's just the natural order of Formula One. Sometimes you just... for every team that's got a strong number 1, you need a reliable, strong number 2 driver alongside them to get the job done. And Valtteri Bottas, if Mercedes win the Constructors' Championship next weekend at Abu Dhabi for a record 8th time in a row, Valtteri Bottas, for his entire time at Mercedes, would have won a Constructors' Championship with them. So it's not a bad record to have for Valtteri Bottas. He very much will have plenty of success that he is equally contributed as much as Lewis Hamilton has to the team in that regard. So, we shouldn't understate that at all. On the incident of itself between Hamilton and Max Verstappen, of course, Esteban Ocon managed to make a great move to go around the outside and managed to get past Lewis Hamilton and all of that to go up into P2. But I wanted to talk about how Michael Massey intervened, I suppose, and how he went about trying to restore peace, I suppose, for the restart and make the right outcome, because in the steward's mind, they were probably going to investigate the incident, and I have no doubt in my mind that they would have penalised Max Verstappen in that one. It was a fair cop, it was Lewis's corner, and Max was not able to complete the move or in his mind retain the lead without overtaking off the circuit. So there's no way he would have been able to restart the race from pole when the red flag came out immediately afterwards. But because of what happened, Michael Masi offered Red Bull a choice. He basically said to them, okay, well, this is my decision. Either I'll give you an option to accept a deal here where if you accept it, Max will start behind Lewis. And, well, obviously it was clear that it was going to start behind Ocon as well because there was a bit of back and forth over it, or it'll be referred to the stewards. Red Bull decided, yeah, okay, we'll start behind Lewis and Ocon in this case and leave it there rather than take any sort of penalty after the red flag situation and go further down. What did you make of that? Were you a fan of that, or do you feel that perhaps they should just let it go to the stewards and let them decide anyway? Because it was one of those that I think Red Bull would have been very grateful for them being offered that option rather than taking a 5-second time penalty later on.
I personally think Red Bull were very clever with the way they dealt with that situation, because they were handed, first of all, if Michael Masi actually turned around and said to, I can't remember who it was on the radio, I think it was Helmut Marko, was it? They said about who Max would be behind, because they originally said that Max would start second, but they didn't state at the start who he would be starting on pole. So they actually turned around and said to the FIA, well, they said to Masi in response, oh, so what, it'll be Ocon in front. So then they had to sort of rejig it a little bit and think, well, no, like, you'll be behind Lewis. And then obviously they've said, no, we'll have to think about it. We'll come back. I think Red Bull sort of caught something quite quick there to think, well, hold on a minute. They've not actually said who's going to be in front of Max. So let's try and sort of make it a bit more interesting, because Ocon was in front of Lewis before the red flag came out, irrelevant of the situation. So that was their argument, to think, well, we'll give the place up, but Ocon also has to pass because he has to give the place up to Hamilton to then Max after, if that was still in a live situation. So Red Bull were very clever to actually negotiate with Red Bull, with the FIA, to turn around and say, well, yes, we'll be behind Hamilton, but to make sure that Ocon is on pole, that's how we're going to do it. And to be honest, I think it was very generous. Easily, you've seen before in the past that a 5-second penalty would have been the norm for that incident. And if racing was still going on live at the time, I do think the 5-second penalty would have been granted. But because of the red flag situation, it would have been, I think it was the best way to actually do it, to be fair. And I think it was quite healthy for the sport to actually see that happen, because you never know, that could happen again. And that could be another situation where they go from there. But as I said about Red Bull, very clever what they did there to actually notice that they didn't actually say beforehand who was starting on pole, to then bring Ocon into the situation, made it a bit more sort of beneficial for themselves. So, as I said before, generous, but at the same time, clever from Red Bull in that situation.
Yeah, I mean, you can't say that, it sets a precedent for future incidents like that. I mean, it was a very strange one because, of course, the incident occurred and then we had the red flag. Then we had to reset the grid based on what the order was, or at least we could figure out almost immediately after the restart, the first restart. So it was a really tough call. But as I said, I thought he handled that situation rather well. Michael Masi, he offered Red Bull the option to say, look, you're not going to win in this. The stewards will side against Max in this, and rightfully they would have done if it was thrown to them. They didn't really have a case to argue. So to offer him that so that Lewis is ahead of Max on the grid for the next one, I think was the right outcome. And of course, not impacting Ocon as well, because he was the innocent party. And it would have been awful for Esteban Ocon if someone told him, no, you've got to start behind Verstappen and Hamilton, when rightfully he should have been leading the race. But of course, that didn't happen. Ocon ended up starting the second restart on pole position, which of course brought us to the next event that we're going to talk about, and that was an incredible piece of driving from all three of them for different reasons. So obviously I'll talk you through the turn of events. They had the start, Max Verstappen. This time though, they took the hard tyres off of Max and put the medium tyres, because Red Bull went for a bit of a gamble and strategy here to go to the end of the race, whilst Lewis stayed on the harder tyres. Lewis was saying, should we have changed tyres? Mercedes felt confident that those medium tyres of Max were going to go off. Eventually they did. Not that it matters anyway. But it brought a tantalising prospect that Max Verstappen was going to gamble and go for it and try and overtake Lewis Hamilton. And in the scheme the grand scheme of things, the way the race played out, it probably was the right decision at the time to get Max ahead of Lewis. But anyway, of course, the start was Max got a bit of a slowish getaway, but in the second phase of it, Hamilton's overtaking Ocon, but he's left a gap open just about enough size to fit a Red Bull in there. And that's what Max Verstappen did. A brilliant piece of overtaking. Some say perhaps a bit aggressive or very risky. But when you're fighting for a world championship against someone as good as Lewis Hamilton, it's been those kind of moments that has been brought out the best in Max Verstappen, where he's had to put it all on the line and leave no space or no stone unturned in order to get the move done. And he did it so brilliantly. And then, of course, alongside him, you had Lewis Hamilton just trying to avoid being taken out in between Max and Esteban Ocon. Manages to survive with a bit of a scrape on his wing. And then Ocon as well, having to take the escape road because he's the unlucky party on the outside of all of it. What did you make of that overtake by Verstappen? Do you feel that that was incredibly brilliant from Verstappen? Or do you feel that perhaps it was a bit risky and he put the onus on the other drivers to not necessarily take evasive action, but to give Max the room that he had forced himself into in order to complete that move?
I think you nailed it there. I think the risk you've got to take when you're going for a world championship, and Max took the risk and it paid off at that point. I think the move was available. I don't think Lewis really... he obviously, at that point, he got a better start than Ocon and obviously shut the door on Ocon. But I just feel that there was not really much else that Lewis could do, because I think that as he was away from, Ocon from passing him, he had to find himself a good exit out of that first two corners. So he couldn't really sort of come inside to then block Max off, because it would have obviously interrupted his viewpoint of passing Ocon later on. But I mean, going back to the pass itself, I mean, Max, that was brilliant. I mean, as I said before, I'm a Max fan. His driving style does remind me slightly of how Schumacher was, a bit aggressive. But I do agree. I think that when you're aggressive like that, I do think when you're fighting for a world championship, you've got to try everything possible, especially when you're coming up against someone like Lewis Hamilton, who is by far the best driver in our generation. He is the man to beat. And Max has done that move, and it's a brilliant move from him. When it pays off, it pays off. Just needs to stay out of trouble. It is what it is. But I mean, it was a brilliant move from him, and obviously got him the lead in the race.
I mean, when you look at incidents like that, that incident ultimately is not going to be talked about too often because it didn't really mean much in the end. If he'd have won the Grand Prix today and we didn't have everything that followed and Max just held Lewis behind him as he did Austin, and he cited that overtake at that restart as the moment he won the Grand Prix, people would be going on about that incident and saying, wow, it was an incredible piece of driving from Max, a great overtake, the sort of move he needed to make to win a world championship. And if he'd have won today's race, there's a good chance he probably would have won the world championship. He may still do, of course. We've got one more race to go, and of course he's got every chance to win it, as he has done all season long. But there have been a lot of people, some drivers, a lot of fans, some pundits as well, that have touted Verstappen's driving as reckless, over-aggressive, borderline dangerous as well. Even though, there are scenarios like today where he made a move like that stick. It was a brilliant piece of driving, in my opinion, a great initiative to go for it. The sort of thing that a lot of people want to see as well. Where do you kind of stand on that with Max Verstappen? Because in my opinion, I feel like you got to take, in some cases, you have to take the good with the bad. I know that's not the best choice of words, and I'm sure a lot of people listening to this will probably say, are you basically encouraging that it's okay for Max to be over-aggressive in certain incidents in the past? That's not really what I'm saying, but sometimes when you've seen drivers of the past, you mentioned Schumacher, Senna was another one, Alain Prost, when Rosberg was fighting Hamilton as well, and even Hamilton himself to a degree at times, sometimes you have to go for those kind of moves. You have to lay it on the line, risk it for the chocolate biscuit, if you like. But sometimes it goes your way, sometimes it doesn't. And in Max's case, sometimes when he does go a bit over the top, I agree, perhaps he needs to rein it in a little bit or not go for every single opportunity that comes your way. But then you start to think about that old Ayrton Senna saying, if you don't go for a gap that exists, you're no longer a racing driver. And that was most certainly a big enough gap to go for, and Max went for it. So judging the whole picture, how do you see it with Max? Do you feel that perhaps he does need to rein it in a little bit sometimes, pick and choose his battles more wisely, if you like, as he gets older and more experienced? Or do you feel that some of the people that have been criticising his driving just need to accept that, Max Verstappen is brilliant at what he does, and that perhaps people are giving him too hard a time on some of his driving standards? I mean, where do you sit on that?
I think it's slightly harsh. I do think because if he makes a mistake, they always look at him as like, oh, he's the bad boy of the sport because he's made a few mistakes in the past. I mean, obviously Monza, you look at Monza, it's his fault. You look at today, I mean, obviously he made the mistake at the restart. And obviously he goes and does that. I think in situations like that, I think he's entitled to actually go for a move. We've seen in the past like other drivers like Danny Ricciardo, for example. He's like the king of the late breakers, as people call him. He's one of the best overtakers in the sport. But he will never be highly criticised because he's never really made many mistakes like what Max has done if he's tried a similar thing. I think Max is quite sort of heavily criticised a lot. I do think that he does sometimes have to sit back when he's made a mistake and reflect and think, I shouldn't have done that. And I do think there's a few times where he'll get single-handedly out to say, oh, he's done this again, he's done that again. But there's other drivers that have made mistakes. I mean, I look at Lewis Hamilton this weekend. I don't want to sort of hold grudges and everything, but Hamilton made 2 mistakes in 6 corners in practice this weekend. I mean, like one on Gasly, and then potentially he nearly caused a crash with Mazepin. I mean, but nothing was said about that. He got a reprimand in the end of it, but the media haven't come out and said, oh, Lewis is dangerous, this and that. He nearly caused a high-speed crash, but Max today obviously caused an incident, but straight away the media are on top of it going, oh, he's done this, he's done that. For me, I think that's where it's a bit uncalled for. But I do think as he grows older into the sport and as he becomes, which he is, one of the best drivers in the sport, he will learn a lot from these situations where he has made mistakes. And let's be real, if he wins it this week, next weekend or next year, whoever, he will be a world champion at some point, and deservedly so. But I do think slightly a little bit they go overboard about his driving style because, as you've mentioned, the names of Schumacher, Senna, Prost, these were highly aggressive drivers, and they were deemed to be the best of the sport in history. Lewis Hamilton, when he was a young driver, when he won the World Championship in 2008, he was very aggressive himself. And he's had to learn and be mature about the way he drives. And there's no reason why Max can't do that in his career going forward in the future. And I also think, just lastly, before I finish off on that point, I think driving alongside a Lewis Hamilton type driver now will definitely help Max in the future going forward. So yes, he's aggressive, but we want to see that in the sport. We want to see overtaking. We want to see this battle between 2 great champions, in my opinion. And yes, he'll need to improve it sometimes, but let him race, as I say.
I mean, it's an interesting point, and yeah, I can understand there are some parties that would want Max to rein it in a little bit and perhaps not put the onus on the other driver to, take not necessarily evasive action, but to adjust their position in that moment to avoid an accident. But do you feel that in the case of battling Lewis Hamilton, that because of how good Lewis is and the machinery that Lewis seems to have right now, I think a lot of people could argue that out of the 2, Mercedes have the all-round better package. I think that's probably been the case since Silverstone. It's just taken up until around Turkey for Mercedes to actually, put it up together, set the car up to Lewis's strength so that Lewis can extract that performance out of it in the way that he's done recently. But has it forced Max to be in a position where Max has to take those risks? Max has to lay it all on the line or find every ounce of ability that he has in order to beat Lewis. I mean, we saw in qualifying how much Max put that car on the ragged edge to the point where he nearly put together one of the greatest qualifying laps we'd ever seen, only to make a mistake at the final corner. Do you feel that because of how good Lewis is, that it's forcing Max to drive to that level? Maybe, pushing the boundaries that arguably so few before him have actually been able to do in the sport.
I agree with that. I think that because Lewis is on a roll at the moment and because he is who he is, I think Max is, definitely having to try and step up in certain ways. And that if it is being a bit more aggressive in certain times, I mean, that that what happened to him in qualifying, it reminded me a lot of the Wall of Champions from Canada. You know, a lot of drivers have gone into that sort of area and they've made the mistake. And I mean, Max again will learn from this sort of situation, but you can clearly see that even if he's not aggressive or not, the talent's there. But because Lewis has stepped up since Turkey this year, or second half of the season, he's been brilliant. It is kind of forcing Max a little bit, as you said, to try and maybe do new tactics to try and see if he can sort of play some mind games and try to find a way to beat Lewis and beat Mercedes. So I expect the same sort of thing in Abu Dhabi. It's going down to the wire. Whatever happens with this investigation, we'll have to wait and see. But I can't see anything different for Abu Dhabi. I just think that these two are going to be fighting to the very, very last lap going into this final race.
I certainly hope so. It just seems inevitable when these two come together. There's always something going on. It's never as simple as one gets a move done on the other one. Perhaps early in the season it seemed that way, but it's just, I suppose blossomed is the only appropriate word, but it's kind of just spiraled out of control at this point to where we just kind of expect what incident are we going to talk about next. And I guess it kind of brings us to where we are, because we ended up with a scenario in the race where Max was ahead of Lewis at that point. Lewis had got ahead of Esteban Ocon rather quickly because Ocon knew he was not going to be fighting with Lewis and Max, and obviously a podium was on the cards for him. So as long as he kept his nose clean, kept his pace up, which until the very, very last moments of the race, quite literally, he looked like he was going to get. But we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But what we saw was the first part of the lap where the driver really had to nail the corners together in a nice rhythm to build up a bit of a gap. And then, of course, the last two sectors where there's a lot of engine performance and straights to worry about. It felt a lot that Max Verstappen had to pull out a gap on Lewis, and then, that would give him the buffer he needed in the final two parts of the lap to keep Lewis behind him. And that was working for a time, to the point where we all thought, well, if Max can keep his tyres together and not make a mistake in that part of the lap, he may have Lewis beat, in the same way that he beat him in Austin earlier in the season when it was a similar situation to a degree. But what ended up happening was, I think it was around about lap 34, 35, we saw a couple of incidents, one which between Tsunoda and Vettel, of course we'll talk about a bit more later on, and then one with Vettel and Raikkonen where a lot of debris and body work was going on the track, which brought out a virtual safety car. And I think what was the key moment here, Luke, was that the virtual safety car came out where Max and Lewis were just entering the first sector. So all of that time where the virtual safety car would obviously keep the cars at a similar gap, it removes that advantage that is won or lost in a safety car or a situation like that. But the time where Max would have built up on Lewis in that first sector, he wasn't able to build it. He'd lost the opportunity on that lap to build a gap over Lewis in the first sector, which would protect him at the rest of the lap, to the point where when they got to the end of the lap, Lewis was on Max's tail in the DRS, and that gave him the opportunity to get the run on him into turn one, which of course brings us towards the first of the major controversial incidents where Max goes in a bit deep to go on the inside to hold Lewis back. He loses the rear end of the car a little bit, which forces him to go off the circuit to stay ahead of Lewis. A bit similar to Brazil, but obviously Max is a bit more out of control this time than in Brazil. How did you see that one go down? Because from what I understand, this was the incident where Max got a 5-second time penalty by the stewards. What did you think? Do you think that was a fair penalty? Or did you think that, based on what we saw at Brazil, that the precedent was set that this probably would have been okay? What were your thoughts on that incident?
I just think with that incident, I felt that you just literally took the words from me. I think because of what happened in Brazil, I think it was very similar. This time round, I do think that Max had track position, even though he did sort of brake late, caused Lewis to maybe sort of yield off a bit more, which he shouldn't have done. But for me, I felt because of the situation in Brazil, they didn't really want to cause any more controversial moments, and obviously that's why they probably awarded Max the 5-second time penalty. In all honesty, I sound a bit biased, but I did think it was slightly harsh just because Max had track position. He didn't have it in Brazil. That's probably why I think in Brazil he got away with it. I think that's always key. I think, don't get me wrong, he's trying to defend his position and he's already still in the position. So, yes, he's obviously gone the corner a bit deep, but it's. I think for me, it's just one of those. I think you just got to sort of get on with it, maybe. But obviously, the stewards see it differently to me. Obviously, they see it differently to other people. They obviously felt that Max obviously got away with it maybe the first time round of the the first incident before the red flag, and this time they felt no, we're not going to let Lewis just overtake him. We're going to give him a 5-second penalty because it's continuously happening. So yeah, I mean, I can understand why they've given it, but I generally felt it was slightly harsh just because Max still had track position at that point.
I mean, I saw the incident back a few times, and I was of a similar opinion. I thought it was a bit harsh. For a few reasons. One, whilst Max does carry that overspeed into the corner and ultimately causes the rear end to lose a little bit of control and it causes him to, go off, I don't think Lewis was going to make the corner anyway. And this is, for me, it's like, it's one thing to judge someone whether or not they're going to make the corner to keep the position. It's another thing to judge the guy that's alongside him thinking, well, if he doesn't do that, does that other car make the corner? I don't think it does. I think the only reason Lewis does end up making the corner anyway is because Lewis is practically stopping to a halt when, Max is sliding a little bit to avoid getting caught. And obviously with the cars so close together, I don't know if they touch or not. The replays weren't really quite clear on it. It didn't look like it, but, there's a lot going on there. And I think Lewis just doesn't really make the corner much himself. So with all that in mind, and bear in mind what we saw at Brazil as well, where Max, it looked like it was a lot more controlled what he was doing in Brazil, and they didn't penalise that. And I said that was a penalty. But because the stewards set the precedent saying it wasn't, after the appeal and the review and everything else got thrown out, an incident like that to me, in that situation, well, I don't think it was as bad as Brazil. But yet they penalised it anyway. But that come a bit later on, and this is another, point of discussion why it's all a bit confusing, because of that, they told Red Bull, right, Max needs to give that place to Lewis. He can't keep the lead after that. He's successfully defended the lead by taking evasive action off the circuit, and he's used that as an advantage. So they've told Max on the radio, the message that we've seen replay a lot after this race, to let Lewis overtake you for the lead, but do it strategically. What that meant to Red Bull, only they will know. I don't think it was a case of do it to make things difficult for Lewis, but just do it in a place where Lewis doesn't get too much ground on you. He takes the lead, you put yourself in a position where you can take it back. And that leaves us on the rundown in the final sector, where the big talking point, where Max Verstappen slows right down on the right-hand side to let Lewis go through. Lewis slows down himself, doesn't overtake Max Verstappen. It all gets very confusing, and then they both go in the Max is sort of going left and right. He's not sure where Lewis is. He's looking all over the place for him. He then goes left to go to the other side. Lewis goes there himself at the same time, and Max slows down. Lewis goes forward, and then they have the big crash. Fortunately, neither driver's races were ruined as a result of that, but that ended up being the moment where everybody is talking about. Of course, what followed after that was Max let Lewis through anyway, but let's break this incident down, Luke. How did you see that go down? Did you consider that as bad driving from Max Verstappen, or, was Lewis Hamilton, should he have overtaken Max earlier and not messed around with it, or was the confusion with the stewards and everything else? Can you break down how you saw that incident and what you thought, now that we've seen it over and over again, what you thought about that?
I mean, I'll put it in a scenario where, I know it sounds a bit silly, but I'll put it in a sscenario where you're driving on the main road and someone goes in the back of you. It's not the guy's fault in front. It's the guy that goes in behind. That's the way you could see it, obviously, to make it easier. I mean, I may be put in a situation as well where Max has obviously been told by the FIA, you've got to let him go. I'm not being funny, but Lewis has said that he wasn't aware of that. I mean, one, Max is slowing down, but then Lewis is as well. Why is Lewis slowing down? Like, why would you slow down if your rival is slowing down? It's not a formation lap. It's not a virtual safety car. It's pure racing. He slowed down for one reason and one reason only, and that's to give position. People are turning around and saying that he was very central. If you look at the pictures that we've seen, Lewis had plenty of room to overtake. Max obviously slowed down, was unsure what was going on. Lewis has admitted today in his post-race conference, that he was worried that Max would have DRS after. So clearly you knew what Max was doing. So if, for example, Max was too central and should have been a bit more further to the side of the track to give Lewis a bit more room, that's fair enough. And maybe Max should be a bit sort of careful with that. But in my opinion, and again, I don't want to sound too biased, if they punish Max and not Lewis, for me, that's ridiculous. I think Lewis, in my opinion, should get at least a reprimand, which he's already had one this weekend. And we all talk about how dangerous Max is, but you clearly see that Lewis also has his bit of a dangerous side to him as well. If Max gets a punishment, I mean, he got a 5-second penalty for the first one that he got. And then obviously he's now under investigation for this incident as well, because apparently he's brake tested him, but Lewis hasn't really helped himself out by saying that he was afraid that he'd have DRS after. So clearly you knew what was going on. And I'm pretty sure that Mercedes, we'll have to hear the race engineers, what their say was at that point. But surely the race engineer at Mercedes is listening to what the Red Bull engineer is saying. So surely they must have known what was going on. They'll obviously argue the case, but for me, I think that's very unfair if Max gets a bigger punishment than Lewis for this situation.
It's a bit of a mess, if I'm honest. Because I don't think there's one party out of this one that comes out with clean hands, if for lack of a better way of putting it. And I don't want to be too extreme about this, because I was very confused about the whole situation. It seemed rather odd that Max would go out of his way. Even the most aggressive fan against Max Verstappen would probably find, whilst they may feel, I'm not surprised Max has resorted to that if they don't like him for whatever reason, but I'd be very surprised as to why Max would go out of his way to try and brake test Lewis in this scenario. Ultimately, if the telemetry proves that Max does brake test Lewis, and Max deliberately tried to force an accident, then he should be punished. Yeah. But I don't think that's the case. I don't even think for a second that was the case. It just seems, it makes no sense for Max to do that, especially when he was in a position where he was in control of the race and still leading it. And the decision over whether or not Max was wrong in that incident at turn 1 on the lap that, before that, we didn't know he was going to get a penalty at the time. That come a bit later on. So that was still up a bit all up in the air and everything else. What really annoyed me about this incident, though, is that the stewards basically said to Red Bull, we think he needs to give, like Marco Massi says to Red Bull, I think he needs to give Lewis the place, otherwise it will be referred to the stewards to investigate and they'll make their own decision on it. So it wasn't even the stewards telling Red Bull for Max to give the place up, it was Michael Massi. And this is where I think it gets a bit of a problem, because whilst I thought I would praise him for his involvement in earlier incidents, and he's allowed to do that as the race director, he can do that, I think sometimes you really have to pick and choose, and I think this is one he should not have got involved in, as crazy as it was, because it creates all the confusion, because the stewards aren't aware of what's going on until they hear of it later on. It's going through so many different channels, and Michael Massey's only one person, so he needs to tell Red Bull that. He also needs to tell Mercedes. Evidently, from what Mercedes are saying, they were not told or made aware that Max was going to do what Max did and try and let Lewis overtake him until it's too late, because it happens so quickly. Red Bull get on the radio to Max. He responds almost immediately, because he obviously felt that was the best place to do it, whether his intention was to try and get DRS going into turn 1 or to try and overtake Lewis at the earliest opportunity, which eventually he tried to do after he let Lewis through cleanly the second attempt. We won't know. But what ended up happening was Lewis was not aware of what Max was going to do, and then Max slows down suddenly. Lewis gets confused. Now, I can understand what you were saying earlier, that Lewis Hamilton probably may have been thinking about the DRS, hence why he slowed down. I did find it strange that Lewis slowed down when Max was slowing down, because Lewis wasn't told what was going on. There were no flags, there were no safety car warnings, there was no lights on his dash, there was no signal to say to Lewis that, oh, you're suddenly going to slow down, don't overtake Max. And look, this isn't me saying Lewis was being silly here or trying to be manipulative of the situation, but I do find it a little bit odd that someone of his experience has won 7 World Championships, could be 8 this time next week, 103 Grand Prix, and has just as many pole positions, and yet his first immediate reaction when his rival slows down ahead of him in a race when there's no prompt to do otherwise is to slow down and not overtake him. What if Max had had a problem and run out of power? Lewis can't tell that Max is braking when he's slowing down. He can assume that he is, but Max could have had a problem. He may have had a sudden loss of power and his car and the aerodynamics are slowing the car down. You know, there's no brake lights on a Formula One car. So Lewis, Lewis doesn't know what's going on. It's only and at this point, I'm looking at the replay over and over and over again. I'm thinking, Lewis, just pull to the left. There's plenty of room on the left-hand side. That's what Max wants Lewis to do. Overtake him, and then they'll carry on. But Lewis doesn't do that. He slows down to practically a crawl like Max was doing, and then Lewis is sort of like, Max is going back and forth. He's looking in his mirrors, trying to find where Lewis is. He can't see Lewis because Lewis is directly behind him. I know people will say, oh, there's mirrors, but if someone's directly behind you like that, you might not be able to see them in your mirrors like that because your mirrors can only see what's the space either side. Might not necessarily see the space directly behind you like that. So, so Max is going left and right. He doesn't know what to do. He's trying to slow down more. He pulls over to the left, but Lewis has gone the same way as Max, thinking, oh, well, they've just gone the same way and gambled on it. And Lewis has tried to put his foot down to overtake Max, and that's where they've collided with each other. It's a scenario that there's so much confusion and ambiguity going on between the two parties at Red Bull, and of course the FIA involved in this as well, and Michael Massey, that has created this scenario where it's an absolute clusterfuck, for a lack of a better way of putting it. And I do apologise for using that kind of language on here, but it's an absolute mess. And I find it really frustrating that the FIA, at first, were looking at Max Verstappen for his part in this, and they were looking at Lewis Hamilton afterwards, and it's like, well, who's reviewing what Michael Massey's involvement in this was? And this is the frustrating thing, because if Michael Massey doesn't get involved, or if he's not so adamant about it and lets them do what they need to do, maybe Red Bull make the decision on their own like they did in Bahrain, or, and Max handles that properly, and Lewis is made aware of what's going on. It's so confusing. They've not handled it well, and what's happened is two drivers have confused each other over all of this because they don't know what's going on, and they've collided. The F1 pundits on Sky F1, they were talking to Toto Wolff afterwards, and Toto Wolff came onto this interview, and I found this really interesting. He came onto this interview with all the information in his mind that he was going to tell them all that Max brake tested Lewis. We've got the proof. Max should be penalised. Bish bash bosh, done. As soon as he's watching it back with them, Damon Hill, Paul di Resta, I think Simon Lazenby as well, his mindset and his wording changes to the point where he actually sees it and thinks, oh, actually, you know what, you guys are probably right there. I think there's so much confusion there. I don't think you can blame Max Verstappen exclusively for this. I think there's a lot of parties involved in this. I don't think you can put it all on Max, or saying that Max deliberately tried to hurt Lewis Hamilton's race or ruin his race like that. I don't think you can do that at all. So I think it was just one of those silly things that's happened between all parties, and everyone's played a part in this where Max has, I don't know what Max was trying to do at the second phase of that when he got confused by it all, or what he was trying to do, whether it was DRS he wanted to get on Lewis, I don't know. Lewis for not overtaking Max when he doesn't know why Max is slowing down. Again, I cite the point that there's no brake lights on a Formula One car. Lewis was not told what Max was doing or trying to do until after they've hit. So how does Lewis Hamilton know that Max doesn't have a problem, hence why he's losing speed when he's slowing down? How does he know that he's braking until the point where they make contact? So I don't buy that line from Lewis Hamilton that Max was playing the game all about the DRS and that he wasn't trying to do that. Because there's only one reason why Lewis probably slowed down, because he knows about where they are on the track, and he knows, probably thinking, oh, well, Max is trying to get the DRS, so I'm going to stay behind him and do it as well. We saw it in an esports race. I think they were trying to do that a little while ago. I know it's not the same thing, but look, that was a long monologue, but that's kind of my opinion on it. I don't think you can punish either driver, or I think something needs to be looked at with these two and say, look, guys, we can't afford you two to be messing around here. It's getting ridiculous now because you two keep coming together, whether it's Max's fault or Lewis's fault or both of them. The end result is it's just making a mockery of what is otherwise an incredible championship, arguably one of the greatest we've ever seen. Maybe the greatest, potentially. So yeah, it was absolutely crazy. So I know there's going to be Lewis fans listening to this are probably going to hate me for saying that I don't think that it was Max's fault 100%. And there are probably going to be Max fans that don't like me for the fact that I think that Max was a bit silly in that. But then Lewis, I think for his part in that as well, Lewis plays his part in that as well. if Lewis just goes around Max, like pretty much almost everybody else would have done the same thing in that situation, just gone to the left and overtook him if a car's slowing down. You've got to be thinking about other things, like, and Lewis is very, very clever. He's thinking about the DRS thing. He's not falling for that. So, look, I'm not saying that's the reason why Lewis didn't overtake Max. I just find it very odd that someone of Lewis's experience in that situation thinks, oh, I'm going to slow right down if my rival ahead of me is slowing down. You don't do that. You don't do that. And you're not going to think someone of that caliber and someone in Formula One is going to deliberately slow down to a crawl and then try and put you in the wall. I mean, we're not talking esports lobbies or anything stupid like that. We're talking real life and actual real people that are at the top of their game. That you just don't get that. But look, we'll wait and see what happens. The stewards are still talking about it. It's being reviewed and that. I just hope no retrospective punishment is given on either driver for this. I think Michael Massey really needs to, whether or not he's capable of doing this job, could be seriously under scrutiny at this point, because there's been a lot of stuff going on this season, a lot of inconsistencies with the steward, not just from him, but the stewards themselves, the FIA's involvement in this, and this battle between Max and Lewis has not been an easy one to judge, but they have not done themselves any favour in all of this. With that grander issue at a whole, how do you feel about that, Luke, by extension with the FIA and the steward, and what do you think that they'll be thinking at this point in time?
What's the fairest punishment? Because I do think both of them will get punished at some point. It sounds mad, but Lewis Hamilton doesn't want a reprimand because he'll get a 10-place grid penalty for the next race, because that'll be his third one, I believe, this year. Max obviously got the 5-second penalty, and they're obviously unsure what the penalty was given for. That's what people have been saying, but I think we clearly know that it was the incident at turn 1. But if they don't punish both drivers, I think that will probably be the best outcome. But looking at the pictures, looking at the replays, Lewis has got plenty of room to overtake Max, and that's where his downfall could be. And obviously, his interview and Toto Wolff saying about, that for me personally, we all know, for me, in my opinion, I actually feel that he didn't want to pass him there because of that DRS section. And it clearly would have, sort of damaged their race a little bit, but it is what it is. I mean, obviously, we just got to get, the inconsistency of the stewards this year have not been great. Let's see what, the Saudi Arabian stewards do about it this weekend. And it could be something different. Like some stewards can think of it differently, but in my opinion, I do think that both of them are going to get some sort of punishment, but obviously what the punishments will be, we'll have to wait and see.
I mean, I think there should just be, I think the stewards or someone should have a word with these two before this final race, whether Liberty Media have to get involved themselves or John Todd. It was like John Todd's final race as the president of the FIA before the next round of elections come through, because he's not standing for re-election. Maybe he needs to have a word with the two of them before this final race next week, because it's all to play for. It's one shootout between the two of them. And yeah, an incident like that, which sees neither of them finish the race, will see Max Verstappen win the World Championship. And I think there's always that fear from non-Max Verstappen fans or Lewis Hamilton fans in this case, and anyone involved at Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton in particular. They're worried that Max may potentially do something that could take them both out and Max will win the championship, like what Senna did to Prost in 1990 at Suzuka, or Prost the year before that, or Schumacher in 94 with Damon Hill and 97 with Jacques Villeneuve. Those kind of incidents that, whether, the intention is there or not, the fact that there's a possibility that it could happen, and it does have the potential to ruin what has otherwise been an incredible championship. I hope and personally believe that Max is not that way inclined and is not going to do that. But I do feel that Lewis does have it all. Max has it all to lose. But if Max puts himself into a position where he feels that, well, if Lewis goes, that's fine if I go with him. I don't know. I'm not Max Verstappen. I personally don't believe he'll think to do that. I think he will try to win this, in his mind, the right way on the track. But I guess you don't know what people are capable of. And who knows what Lewis could do. We've seen Lewis get his elbows out quite a few times. Who's to say that Lewis doesn't put Max in a position where it forces Max into a position where he ends up retiring or something like that, and Lewis goes on to win? I mean, look, we know Lewis knows how to win a world championship, and Lewis likes to race the right way, but this season has certainly brought out perhaps a different side of Lewis Hamilton at certain places where Lewis has not has tried at certain points to try and not give Max an inch. You know, he did that earlier in the race. All right, it was fair, but, you know, he weren't giving Max the room that he needed. But then, of course, later on in the race, as we should probably move forward with this review, when Max eventually did let Lewis go, he then re-overtook him straight away again, which I thought was a bit strange why he did that. But then he then tried to let Lewis through again at turn 27, but then Lewis forced him literally all the way wide and off the circuit. A bit strange. Lewis obviously was very angry about what had happened, and perhaps that was, you know, part of why Lewis did that. And that's something that the steward's also talking to him about, because as you mentioned, Luke, the reprimand, that if Lewis does get another reprimand for his driving, whenever that may be, it will result in a 10-place grid penalty for the next Grand Prix, which of course, if he does get one, means he will start with a grid penalty going into the final race of the season, which will be the worst thing to happen to Lewis Hamilton before the start of the final race. You know, what were your thoughts on that incident between? Do you think Lewis needed to do that, or was he just trying to let off some steam, or better yet, was he just trying to stop Max from doing what he did the last time when he let Lewis through and re-overtake him again? Because it seemed like, to me, a little bit of all three in a way, but what were your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I can't say no more on that. I do think that Lewis is trying to protect Max from trying to re-overtake him, but at the same time, it's a bit of revenge, really. You know, like, I'm not going to allow you the space. You know, I'm going to be... Oh, my microphone nearly fell off there. I'm going to be a bit, I don't know, a bit more dirty tactics, as you were saying, Adam, I think, for me. He got the black and white flag from it. And I generally think I believe from these situations, I think that's happened all this weekend with Lewis. I think he's not really been harshly punished by. I think Max, this is what I meant earlier about, you know, when Max makes one mistake, straight away it's Max is this and Max is that, and if he has made the mistake, he deserves to be punished. But Lewis has made about 3 or 4 mistakes this weekend, and he's not had one punishment. So I do believe that the FIA should really look into it. I mean, he got the black and white flag for that thing in the end. He's obviously done this. He's done the 2 in practice. For me, Red Bull have come out and said that they've been unfairly treated. So who knows? I mean, if he gets the reprimand, it's obviously advantage Red Bull, because obviously it's obviously a winner takes all race at the moment as it stands. I'll sound very biased, and I know I do, but to be quite honest with you, if you look at on this weekend, why Max has been punished for 1 offence and Lewis hasn't for 4 offences, where's the balance in it? You know, for me, and I think the stewards have been all season long, it's just been very inconsistent. So hopefully they get the decision right, whatever they do decide to do with both drivers from these incidents.
I think both drivers and teams, respectively, in their own way, are right in that they probably feel that the other side have had preferential treatment. There have been cases that we've seen recently where Max has perhaps been a bit over the line and should have been penalised for it. I think Brazil was a good example of that, but it didn't happen. As you mentioned, Lewis a few times this season, and even today, you know, perhaps wasn't penalised for certain things. And both drivers understandably feel aggrieved that this has now become a battle of penalties. I think Max Verstappen kind of summed it up in his post-race interview when he was saying that when he was voted driver of the day, which is quite funny in a way, Max Verstappen driver of the day. There's always that meme associated with it. Especially when he was first in Formula One, the old driver of the day meme. But he was basically saying along the lines of that, you know, at least I've got the fans on side with me, or at least the fans that voted in the poll. Of course, this is a voting poll. It's not necessarily an actual, who's the actual driver of the day. Sometimes it can just be a popularity contest, and which certainly wasn't shared by the locals, because I think a lot of local fans that were there were very much booing Max Verstappen at the race as well. But then, of course, you've got Lewis, who probably feels that Max, you know, should have been penalised for certain things, and, you know, vice versa. So it's hard to say. All I can say, and all I can agree with both fan bases, and I'd like to think I come across as a bit of a neutral in this because I support Ferrari, although for me, I don't care who wins this championship, really. I'm just enjoying the show, as long as it doesn't go too far and get toxic and tainted. And in some cases this season, I think we have been, if not very close, pretty much over the line when it comes to that sort of thing. I'm just hoping we have a great show at the final race of the season, and then may the best man win. We'll just have to wait and see. But
I do sorry to apologise. Max Verstappen has been awarded a 10-second time penalty for causing a collision.
Right. Okay. So that
He
doesn't.
keeps
Does that?
he keeps P2. He's been given a 10-second time penalty and he's been awarded 2 penalty points, but he will keep second position because he obviously finished 10 seconds in front of the driver who finished third, which was Bottas. With
Right.
Lewis, I don't know what's going on. They haven't said anything about Lewis yet, but Max has been given a 10-second time penalty.
Well, yeah, I've just checked it on myself. I'll be honest with you. I get it. I'm not sure it's necessary because I feel like there's a wider issue at play with that decision than Max being. For me, that just implies that they're blaming Max 100% for this incident. And it was clumsy, and Max does play a part in all of this, probably the biggest part of all. But as I said, I think the stewards and the FIA need to look at themselves over this because I think the way they've handled this and the way Mercedes said to them, that I think it was Ron, I can't remember his last name, Ron at Mercedes was saying to him on the radio that we weren't aware of what Red Bull and Max were going to do. So it confused everybody, including Lewis Hamilton. But then I'd still argue the point, well, why is Lewis not overtaking Max when Max is slowing down? He's saying that Max is trying to slow down or brake test him, but Lewis didn't know what was going on with Max until after they hit. He could have had a mechanical issue or something like that. Lewis is not going to stay behind and try and follow him. Yeah. So I'm not sure I'm happy about the precedence of that penalty. The only good thing that comes from that is that hopefully we can just put that behind us now, focus on the next race. Max doesn't lose any more points, so it's not like they've affected the championship anyway. So that's always a good thing. So it could potentially just be a nice little get-out-of-jail-free card for the stewards to say, well, we can punish Max for his involvement in that, and it won't affect the race result. So hopefully we'll just leave it at that. But yeah, I think, look, let's move on. We've already talked a lot about all of these incidents. There's a lot to cover. Ultimately, it leads us to the final point of the season now. Of course, Lewis with that fastest lap as well as the race win, I should say, before I slow my words a little bit, is that they're now both level on points going into the final Grand Prix of the season. Where are your thoughts at, Luke? I know you want Max Verstappen to win. I'm sure a lot of people listening to this will want Lewis Hamilton to win. We've had Lewis Hamilton fans. We've actually had a lot of Lewis Hamilton fans on this podcast, so it does make a change to bring on some Max fans, I suppose, by contrast. Where are your thoughts going into the final race? Because Lewis has won the last 3 races in a row. He's looking in supreme form. He seems to have the edge over Max in terms of car performance, what Lewis is doing out on track, and the momentum. So is Lewis going to win that elusive 4th race in a row and become world champion? Or do you think Max is going to pull it out of the bag at the final moments? Squeaky bum time, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still confident that Max can get the job done. We've seen that he is on par with the Mercedes pace. I know the straight line speed is obviously very difficult to match with Mercedes and with Lewis, but, over a one-shot qualifying, Max is definitely up there. He's definitely... he definitely had the advantage this weekend in qualifying, apart from that mistake he made. And that could have, made the race a lot different if he would have qualified on pole. I still believe, I still feel that he can win this championship, and I'm still going to stick by him. They've obviously changed the Abu Dhabi track a little bit, but there could be some parts of the track which could suit the way Red Bull are. I mean, they're very good in the slower speed corners and the higher speed corners compared to Mercedes. You see in Sector 1 today, Verstappen was rapid, throughout that part of the track. And that could really be the decisive moments where Verstappen from the start of the lap or towards the end of the lap could be a lot stronger than Lewis. So, yeah, I'm still sticking with him. I mean, if whoever wins the championship, I mean, obviously, yes, I do want Max to win it, but whoever wins the championship, they deserve it. I'm not going to be bitter and say, Lewis don't deserve this, don't deserve that. He deserves it over the course of the 22, 23 races there are. But I just want to see something different. And I do think Max has brought, for me, I've liked watching him race over the last couple of years, but this season he's brought so much more different to the sport. Irrelevant of his controversy, he's made the sport much more enjoyable. And we've actually got someone who can actually challenge Lewis Hamilton and get under his skin, basically, because let's be real, Lewis Hamilton probably is, sorry about my language, but pissed off with the fact that he's got someone to actually compete alongside him until the very last race of the season. And he's not having it his own way. He has the last few races with his wins, but for me, I've really enjoyed watching both of them. But I've enjoyed watching Max this season. I think he's been brilliant, and I really hope he brings it home this year. I think it'll be very good for the sport, and it makes it interesting for next year with the new regulations.
It's a lot of good points, and it is a good point with Lewis Hamilton. He's often said that he's wanted this competition. He's wanted to be pushed all the way. He said he enjoys and thrives on this. I think there was a point in the season earlier on where Max was dominating, Red Bull were dominating, Max had the upper hand on Lewis, all ends up. And Lewis clearly wasn't enjoying it, neither were Mercedes. But, obviously now that things are going their way again, whilst it's been very difficult to enjoy because of certain reasons, I'm pretty sure he's probably enjoying this battle a lot more than he was 4 or 5 months ago. And sometimes you just got to accept, no matter how successful you are in this sport, if you want that competition, you're asking for it, and this is how it comes, maybe this is the only way someone can beat Lewis Hamilton driving the way that Max Verstappen is driving at the moment and what Red Bull are doing. Maybe this is what it takes. There was a time where we thought Michael Schumacher was unbeatable, and then Alonso got under his skin, not necessarily in the same way, but it can take that for a change of the guard, if you like, or for someone to beat the king of the sport, if you like, for lack of a better way of putting it. And Lewis has certainly put himself in that position. So either way, it's been an incredible season, and I hope we can look back on it for all the good moments. I just feel that we've still probably got one more twist in the tail in the final race of the season. I started the season back in Max Verstappen. I've said for a long time I thought Max Verstappen was going to win the championship. Given what I've seen the last couple of races, though, not necessarily the drivers, although there has been an element of that to it, but the performance change between the two teams and the packages available and what the drivers are able to get out of them, I feel like Max is driving to the absolute maximum capacity that he can in this car. And Lewis in that Mercedes, the way Lewis is driving right now and the way the car has improved, I just feel that that combined package has the edge, and it will continue to do so in the final race. I know a lot of people have said that in the past, whilst Mercedes was strong at Abu Dhabi in the turbo hybrid era, Red Bull obviously dominant there before. And given the characteristics of the Red Bull now, where it's very strong at a rear limited circuit, and Abu Dhabi used to be a rear limited circuit before the changes this year. Of course, we'll have to wait and see if that's still the case. I would have backed Max and Red Bull to win here. Given the changes to the track that I've seen, I'm wondering if some of those changes will reflect some of the characteristics at Qatar, where Mercedes and Hamilton turned out to actually be quite strong. Now, there is a caveat to this, because what we did see at this race was that Red Bull seemed to be on top of their rear wing issues that they were suffering with the DRS flaps going up and down and damage caused to the rear wing, which prevented them from running a skinny low rear wing. They kind of went low-medium this weekend, and I expect them to do something similar at Abu Dhabi. So that is encouraging in terms of the outright pace, but they do seem to lack the straight line speed advantage that Hamilton still seems to possess. Will he still have that going into the final race? Will the engine hold out? We'll have to wait and see, because it's on a bit of a knife edge with the reliability of that engine. It's either amazing or it's terrible. There's no in between. So we'll have to wait and see what happens with Lewis. It's just going to be so close. I can't pick a winner, but if I had to, sorry, Max fans. I know I backed him all season, but I'm just going to have to go with Lewis. I think Lewis is going to do it, and it pains me to say this as a diehard Michael Schumacher fan, but I just feel it's inevitable that Lewis is going to win that 8th world title. I would love to see Max Verstappen win it, and I hope I'm wrong. And given my track record of predictions this season, I've been wrong more often than I've been right. So maybe that trend will continue. We'll have to wait and see. Let's quickly run through some of the other races before we sign off this episode, Luke. And I appreciate you spending the time that you have done with us. I know you want to get to bed and start. Obviously, you've got a busy day, this busy week. As I say, of course, you're getting married this weekend. Of course, I should know that. I'm your best man, so I should know about that. But yeah, so very, very busy week indeed for you and me in that regard. But look, let's look at some of the other races. Now, first one, of course, Bottas and Ocon. Bottas, of course, taking that podium off of Esteban Ocon, so crucially taking it off of him at the final hurdle of the race, the final straight, a 10th of a second it was that separated them, I believe. And you could hear Ocon on the radio, excruciatingly painful to lose out on that podium for Alpine. Bottas taking it. I mean, not so much with Bottas's race, because he he almost ended up in the back of Max Verstappen after one of the restarts. But Esteban Ocon, how did you rate his weekend?
Quite good, actually, because Alpine struggled with a lot of pace. I mean, Alonso struggled this weekend. To find himself in that position, obviously, at some point he was leading the race. No strangers to be leading the race either as well. Esteban Ocon, he's obviously a race winner. I felt so sorry for him. I think he deserved that. He deserved that podium finish. I mean, don't you think Mercedes have had enough glory this weekend and over the last few weeks? I mean, to be fair, Bottas would have slowed down. He'd have got a 10-second penalty. But it's yeah, I felt for him. And you can see his reaction, obviously, when he just didn't have I mean, Bottas had the advantage of DRS and slipstream. His reaction, he slammed the steering wheel. He just obviously was so disappointed. But a good weekend for Esteban Ocon. I don't think for any moment from the start of this weekend he'd have thought he'd have finished in the top four. I think that's, what a performance from Alpine over the last two races. Alonso with the third place and Ocon with fourth today. Really giving Alpine a real bit of confidence going into this last race. And I believe they're above AlphaTauri, I think now, are they, in the Constructors? I believe. I'm not sure if I'm right, but obviously that must put them in a good position, being above them.
Yeah, they're 29 points ahead of them now. I would say, other than an absolute calamity from Alpine and an equally incredible weekend by epic proportions for AlphaTauri, I'm pretty sure Alpine have got fifth wrapped up in the Constructors' Championship now.
So, yeah, I mean, good weekend for Ocon. I think he's, as I said, fourth place is a brilliant finish, but just, I mean, Bottas has done it again with On the Line. He done it with Lance Stroll. And he's obviously done it with Esteban Ocon. So I think Bottas is the master at the drag race, as people would like to call it.
Yeah, it's just one of those things, really. And yeah, I've got Courtney sending me messages because Courtney's not with us this weekend. He's got other more important things to tend to. Sending me a image on Twitter, social media, saying Mad Max is trending. So no secrets for who Courtney's back in at the moment.
The so-called neutral of the sport, I should say.
I mean, there was a time where we were trying to be neutral on this, but clearly that wasn't really helping for us. I mean, it's easier for me to be neutral in this because I don't really have a stake between Max and Lewis, to be honest. I just kind of make a decision and hopefully I'm right on that one. Just have to wait and see. But anyway, look, everyone has a stake in this in Formula One. You've always got a bias one way or the other. No one's actually truly neutral in this sport, or any sport for that matter. That's why you get into it. But as I said, I digress. So yeah, of course, looking at other races, of course, Ricciardo coming fifth place. He kept his nose rather clean and had a good weekend. It was one of his better weekends. We didn't really see much of him. He managed to ride the storm, work his way through after a somewhat difficult qualifying session. I think McLaren would have been hoping for a bit more, but fifth place, I think they'd have been relatively happy with that. They finished ahead of the Ferraris, of course. Gasly P6 again. Pierre Gasly's always been there or thereabouts, and it was another difficult weekend for a lot of guys, but he did a good job, got P6. And then that brings us back to the two Ferraris, Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz. Now, Charles Leclerc, of course, had that accident in FP2, similar place to Mick Schumacher, so I think a lot of people wondering why the red flag was out. They did the same thing in FP2, so I think it was the right call for a red flag to be brought out for that one in the race. Charles Leclerc was at P4, doing a rather good job after qualifying, keeping Perez well behind him, but of course couldn't keep up with the guys ahead of him. But then that red flag really hurt his chances after the safety car because he pitted, so he lost some places and ended up having a nice little battle with his teammate who started a bit further down. But Charles Leclerc ended up pipping Carlos Sainz at the end of the race to finish ahead of him. And I think whilst Ferrari look like they've got P3 in the Constructors all but wrapped up, I think McLaren scored one more point than they did than them. So it's like 38.5 points in Ferrari's favour. Again, McLaren would have to come first and second, and Ferrari would have to score practically nothing for that to change hands. Whilst it's happened, I don't think Ferrari, the way that they're going, are going to relinquish that position right now. And McLaren clearly aren't matching the heights that they were doing at Monza and arguably Sochi as well. But it was a nice little battle between Leclerc and Sainz. And in a way, Sainz obviously having to come through from a difficult position because of damage he sustained in qualifying. I think it was very important for Leclerc to get the result over his teammate today because Sainz has been extremely consistent. I think it's 14 races in a row, something like that. He's scored points. He's now scored more points, the most points of any driver in F1 without a race win. And his season has gone from strength to strength, Carlos Sainz. I think for Leclerc, for his position in the team as the de facto number one driver, if you like, although it's a lot closer than that, how important was it for him today to get the result and stay ahead of his teammate? Because it would have looked a bit strange if Sainz had managed to beat him today, although it was very, very close.
I was waiting for Charles Leclerc on the radio to be like, if he lost to his teammate, and said, "I am stupid." I mean, that's obviously the Leclerc moment. But I think Carlos Sainz, I mean, it was very important for Leclerc, obviously, to finish above his teammate. But I felt very sorry for Sainz. I think he was very quick in qualifying. I think that Sainz could have potentially got a top 5 finish in qualifying if he wouldn't have had the problems. And yeah, I mean, as everyone calls him, he's a smooth operator, isn't he? He's just this season, or second half of the season, he's just been very good. And it looks very promising for Ferrari next season, especially with the new rule regulations. And, you know, over the last year or so, there's always been that determination for the 2022 car. Can Ferrari get themselves back in a position to win races? And for me, they've got 2 very good young drivers that are, you know, Sainz hasn't won a Grand Prix yet. He's been in a couple of positions where he could have won one, but Leclerc is obviously a race winner. They've got a good balance to their team. And I think Ferrari, for the first time for a long time, are very content that their drivers are actually fighting for position, because I believe that there's such a good team balance and a good team morale there that they're both trusting of each other. And you know, Leclerc finishing above Sainz today is obviously good for him, for his personal milestone, but it looks very promising for Ferrari, and they've definitely deserved this 3rd place finish in the Constructors' Championship, it looks like.
Sorry, I was just having a look on Twitter to see something, because the stewards obviously giving their reason for the Verstappen penalty. He's basically their explanation to this that was key in this decision is that the driver of car 33 then brakes suddenly and significantly, resulting in the deceleration of 2.4 G. 10 seconds is given for being predominantly at fault for causing a collision. Also 2 penalty points for Verstappen. For me, look, I get it, but I think that's a bit of a cop-out from the stewards. I think that, again, it's one of those where they've just basically tried to find any excuse to pin it on Verstappen, in this case, to save their own bacon. I think at the end of the season, I think there's going to be a lot that's got to be looked at into the stewards in the sport, and the way that the races have been directed as well. I think it's been a bit of a shambles, if anything. But you know, and it created all this kind of confusion and everything else, and I think there's a lot more to it to that. Fortunately, as I said before, the race result has not been affected by this, so hopefully we can just ignore that and move on. Looking at some of the other races as well. You know, like as I said with Ferrari. Yeah, as I said, overall it's a good weekend. You know, they would have wanted more, but I think how crazy things turned out. The fact that they didn't really lose any, they lost 1 point to McLaren this weekend, and I think for them finishing 3rd is the priority. It's the target, and yeah, they're pretty much there. They pretty much achieved what Mattia Binotto said earlier this season was the minimum objective. I think for them probably would have been the maximum one, and their drivers are doing a great job. Charles Leclerc is now ahead of Lando Norris in the Drivers' Championship, and Carlos Sainz looks like he could do the same after Abu Dhabi if he keeps his form up as well. So more reasons for Ferrari to be happy if they can get their guys to be 5th and 6th in the Drivers' Championship as well. I think they'll be very, very happy with that one. Should say a shout out to Antonio Giovinazzi, you know, the driver who's going to Formula E next season. He's not going to be in Formula 1. Finishes in the top 10. In 9th place, did a great job. You know, he was quick in qualifying. He was quick all weekend long, Giovinazzi. He really was quick. At one point, he was ahead of both Ferraris on the track. So, yeah, he did a great job. So well done to him. Lance Stroll ended up in P11. Of course, Norris obviously had to recover. He had a good qualifying, but he got caught out in all the stuff with the red flags, where he was complaining that it wasn't fair that some of the drivers got to have a free change of tyre. I think Lando benefited from that in Imola earlier this season.
He was saying about Gasly as well from Monza.
Yeah,
saying that he benefited for his race win. But
I think that, in fairness, I think in Imola, Lando got a free choice of tyres to change in that race, and that allowed him to get ahead of Charles Leclerc, who was running in P2 at the time, and Charles Leclerc was well ahead of him at the time as well. So I can understand the frustration, and I know a lot of fans will raise the debate about should they be allowed to change tyres under red flag. I think under the circumstances that red flags caused, I think you should be allowed to do that, and also, repair damage on your cars. That's part of the red flag because you're restarting the race. You should be allowed to do that. I know it doesn't sound great, but people will moan about it when it goes against you, but you don't hear them complaining about what they benefit from. I mean, look at Imola. Look at Imola this season with Lewis Hamilton. Because he was complaining about that with Max today, but Lewis Hamilton benefited from a red flag from a crash that it wasn't from him, obviously, but he'd had a crash, brought him a lap down, the car was damaged, he was all over the place, red flag come out, he was able to unlap himself, repair his car, put on a set of soft tyres, fresh ones, ended up finishing P2. And that could ultimately play a part in winning the championship, depending on how close it is. If he was a lap down, he wouldn't have been nowhere near P2. So, it swings and roundabouts. Sometimes it goes in your way, sometimes it goes against you. That's just sport for you. You can't moan every single time something like this, especially when I think it's fair. That's just how it goes.
Do you know what it reminds me of? As a footballing point of view, do you know, like when teams are wasting time? It reminds me of that. 1 week, you can't stand it. You're like, they're wasting time, blah, blah. The following week, if you're in a position where you're winning a game by a certain goal, for example, obviously you're going to waste time. So, as you said, it swings and roundabouts.
Yeah. No, that's just how it goes. People are always going to moan about it when it goes against you, but I don't really... It's been a rule that's been around for a long time. It's not changed for years. I don't know why we're nitpicking over specific rules when it goes against a certain driver or this... Max
Verstappen was in front.
It's not so much Max. I'm just saying based on what Lando was saying. He was complaining about it. I'm like, well, yeah, but you had it go your way in another race. And I'm sure it'll go against Gasly in a different race, and it'll go... that's just how it goes. That's sport for you, unfortunately. You just got to deal with it. But otherwise, Lando was doing all right this weekend until there, so it was a bit unfortunate. But, that's kind of summed up hit the second half of his season. He's been trying, but it's just not really gone his way. As brilliant as he was in the opening part of the season, he was fantastic. Stroll P11, Aston Martin had a difficult weekend, and Stroll tried to take advantage of this. He had a bit of a coming together with George Russell, who obviously didn't finish today. But, there's not much I could do about that. Nicholas Latifi, P12. Didn't really see much of Latifi. It was a difficult weekend for Williams, of course, remembering Frank Williams, who sadly passed away in the week. But Latifi kept his nose clean. It was a solid drive for him and finished in P12. Alonso had some mechanical issues with his car that he was dealing with, so that really compromised his race in P13. And then this brings us to Tsunoda. And, look... With Yuki Tsunoda, it's been a tough year for him, a tough rookie season. There was a lot of promise. A lot of people thought he would stand out. Obviously, I think has he been the best rookie this year, Yuki Tsunoda? He must have done, purely because I think the others are in terrible cars. No disrespect to Haas, but that's the situation we find ourselves in. So he is going to go down as the rookie of the year, although Fernando Alonso jokingly probably might go down as the rookie of the year, even though he's technically not a rookie. But this season, Yuki Tsunoda has had some good days, but he's had more difficult days and more difficult moments that he's caused himself. And he had another one of those today with Sebastian Vettel at turn 2, where Vettel overtakes him quite easily into turn 1, and Vettel goes into turn 2, and for some reason, Tsunoda just pile drives him. There's no other way of putting it. There is no way that Tsunoda is going to make that corner and think that Vettel's got to get out of his way when Vettel's well ahead of him. And he's took Vettel out. He's complaining on the radio, and he's damaged his car, and he's completely wrecked his own race. Now, I don't get it with Tsunoda, because this year, Gasly has been phenomenal. He's beaten both Alpine drivers comfortably in the Drivers' Championship. So if Tsunoda contributes at least even half of what Gasly has done, AlphaTauri would be in this fight for P5, something that they've never had before, even as Minardi, I'm trying to think of the other teams that Minardi used to be, but, everything that Franz Tost has been involved in, he's always wanted that elusive P5 in the Constructors or more, and they've been so close this year. And, owing to a bit of bad luck, and Alpine just turning it on when it matters most, and some moments of madness from Tsunoda, it's just not happened. So, I mean, what did you make of that incident, Luke? And are you worried that if Tsunoda doesn't sort of change the way that he handles these sorts of situations, or has less of them, that he may find himself under a bit of pressure to stay in the team beyond next season?
That incident with Vettel, that reminded me of me when I was playing the games. Like when you're just annoyed that you've lost your position, you just think, sorry, I'll just knock them. so I'll get in front of him. That was just awful. That really was. At no point as you said, at no point is he going to lose that position and think, Vettel's going to yield for me if I dive bomb down into turn 2. I mean, you don't do that to a 4-time world champion. There's just respect. Sebastian Vettel is still one of arguably the best drivers on the grid. He's won 4 world titles. He hasn't won 4 world titles for nothing, and I just couldn't believe it. How you're not going to gain respect from someone like that, where Tsunoda really has struggled. In my opinion, I don't think he's good enough. I know he's still a young kid, and I know he's obviously learning, and I know it does take time for certain drivers. But for me, I feel that he's not good enough for Formula One. I think next season is going to be very pivotal. If Gasly's still performing the way he is and Tsunoda's not, I do think Valtteri may make an early decision, because we do know within the Red Bull ranks, they do like to make early decisions, and it wouldn't surprise me if Valtteri did the same thing. Obviously, there's obviously drivers around. Kvyat could potentially come back, or it's not going to happen now. But there was an Albon talks, and there was other drivers you could look at. But it would not surprise me next season if Tsunoda doesn't get his act together the first few races. They could make a decision.
May well be. I mean, we're going to be lucky to see Alex Albon again at the Williams, so certainly looking forward to seeing him next season back in Formula One. And, in this pressure cooker, I should say, terrible way of putting it, in this pressure cooker, I'll tell you, this is podcasting, but you can tell I don't edit these very well or very much. This is what happens when you travel home after a long weekend. You're absolutely shattered. It's nearly 11 o'clock. And we're just wrapping this up in the evening after a crazy race. So, yeah, sorry, guys, a bit of a mess all over the place. But in this pressure cooker situation that Yuki Tsunoda finds himself in for next season, he really does have to up his game, because Pierre Gasly has been phenomenal this season at parts, and, your teammate needs to be there with you. Of course, we're not expecting Tsunoda to be on Gasly's level. That's a really hard sale for a lot of guys in the paddock, not just Tsunoda. But he's got to do a better job next season. And I think that whilst he's had some good moments, there have been a lot of moments that lesser Formula One drivers that have been in this sport would not be doing at this point in the season after so much has happened already. It's the same mistakes, and you can't keep making them, no matter how much potential he's got. I think that's pretty much all that we need to wrap up for this episode. I realise it's quite long, so I'm going to leave it there. Luke, before we sign off, obviously you've got your own channel and your own podcast. Do you want to tell our viewers and our followers and our listeners, of course, where they can find you?
Yeah, so thanks for letting me come on again. Actually, I enjoyed this one. I'm just a bit tired myself. But on YouTube, we're at 1892 Reds Podcast. We obviously do Liverpool podcasting, but obviously if you're not a Liverpool fan, you obviously please come and subscribe to the channel. Obviously if you are a Liverpool fan, then obviously where have you been, so come and subscribe. We're doing on Wednesday night, we're going to be doing our Aston Villa preview, so yeah, come and join us for that one. And yeah, thanks for letting me come on, and let's go Max Verstappen. Let's try and win this championship next week.
Well, we'll have to wait and see. But yeah, absolutely right, guys. Of course, if you are a Liverpool fan or a football fan and you want to listen to a podcast about the mighty Reds from Liverpool, you can tune into the 1892 Reds podcast. And Luke and his co-host Rick, who has been on this show and is certainly not shy of giving his views, even on Formula One.
Very happy he is, yeah.
Yeah, big Lewis Hamilton fan. So yeah, he wouldn't have been shy to have a few opinions today. But anyway, you can check those guys out. Of course, if you have enjoyed this episode of the podcast, please consider liking it if you're watching on YouTube and subscribing to the channel. And of course, if you are following us on your favorite podcasting platform, please do consider following us and giving us a nice 5-star review. We'd really appreciate that. And it helps out the channel as well. All that's left to say, guys, is thank you so much for tuning in. Stay safe. And for the penultimate time this season, we reviewed a Grand Prix, and we've got one more to go, the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, and we'll be doing our preview in the week. Who is it going to be? Is it going to be Max Verstappen with his first world title, or Lewis Hamilton? Will he win the elusive 8th world title? History awaits, just like F1 says, and so will we, but not for much longer. Until next time, we've been DNF1, and we will see you in the next episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. Take care.